On the afternoon of November 24, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Morgan, the former pilot of the famous Memphis Belle, lifted his B-29 Superfortress Dauntless Dottie off the runway at Isley Field on Saipan in the Mariana Islands, at the head of the first formation ever to strike Tokyo from these newly captured bases. At 31,000 feet, well above the effective combat altitude of most Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns, Morgan looked down through scattered cloud and saw the Japanese capital spread beneath him like a map. For the first time since the Doolittle raid in April 1942, Tokyo was under direct attack from American heavy bombers. The flight lasted 14 hours, burned 7,000 gallons of fuel, and dropped only 88 tons of bombs on the Nakajima Musashino aircraft factory, yet the psychological impact inside the Japanese high command was immediate and profound. The B-29 had arrived, and it flew higher, faster, and farther than anything Japan possessed or had even imagined. For 3 years, Japanese military planners had believed that geography and altitude would protect the home islands. Their best interceptors, the Ki-44 Tojo and Ki-84 Frank, had service ceilings of around 36,000 to 39,000 feet on paper, but in practice, they struggled to operate effectively above 30,000 feet due to engine overheating, reduced maneuverability, and lack of pilot oxygen. Standard anti-aircraft guns, such as the Type 88 75mm, had effective ceilings around 25,000 feet, while the 120mm Type 14 reached about 30,000 feet, with limited accuracy. Experimental weapons like the Type 4 75mm, a reverse-engineered Bofors design deployed in small numbers around Tokyo in the summer of 1944, could theoretically reach 33,000 feet, but with only about 70 units produced and poor precision at those heights. They offered little real defense. Japanese radar, such as the Type 3 Mark I Model 4, could detect aircraft at long range, but provided inaccurate height data above 25,000 feet. In short, the operational sky above 30,000 feet was considered a sanctuary for high-flying threats. That sanctuary vanished on November 24th. The 20th Air Force, commanded by Major General Curtis LeMay, under General Hap Arnold's direct orders, had been created specifically to operate the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, an aircraft so advanced that its development cost more than the Manhattan Project. Pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled gun turrets, a ceiling of over 36,000 feet, a top speed of 360 miles per hour, and a combat radius of over 3,000 miles made it a weapon Japan had no answer for. Early raids in 1944 had come from China-based fields under Operation Matterhorn, with the 58th Bombardment Wing, very heavy, staging from Sichuan since June, targeting steelworks in Kyushu and Manchuria. These missions were logistically challenging and achieved limited damage, but they flew consistently above 30,000 feet, and not a single B-29 was lost to fighter interception. The capture of the Marianas in mid-1944 changed everything. Bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were just 1,450 miles from Tokyo, well within the B-29's range. The first operational wing there, the 73rd, became active in December, but the raid of November 24th marked the shift to sustained operations from these islands. The reaction inside the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force was immediate denial. Lieutenant General Kyoji Tominaga, chief of the Air General Staff, told a meeting of senior officers in December 1944 that the Americans were simply wasting fuel flying so high, and that their bombs were falling harmlessly into rice fields. The few Ki-84 pilots who managed brief contact with the new bombers reported that the B-29s were slow to turn and vulnerable if brought down to fighting altitude. Orders went out to develop emergency high-altitude modifications, methanol water injection for the Homar engine, stripped armament, and polished airframes. None of these measures improved effective combat performance above 30,000 feet more than marginally. By January 1945, the picture had darkened. The 21 Bomber Command, now under LeMay's direct control from the Marianas, began regular missions from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Japanese radar on Iwo Jima began tracking formations at 200 miles, but by the time fighters scrambled, the bombers were already overhead at 32,000 feet and climbing. On January 27th, 110 B-29s struck Tokyo's Nakajima Musashino aircraft plant. Only 3 were damaged by flak, and none were lost. Japanese fighters managed to reach the bombers on only 4 occasions all month, and in each case, the B-29 defensive fire, 12 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon in the tail, drove them off. The most alarming report came from Major Shiro Kuromaru of the 47th Sentai, who flew a specially modified Ki-84 with stripped guns and polished wings to 35,000 feet on January 27th. He managed to close on a lone B-29 and fire a short burst before his engine overheated and his controls froze. The bomber never even noticed him. Kuromaru's report ended with a sentence that circulated through the Army Air Force headquarters in Tokyo. They fly in a different world. By February, the Japanese High Command understood that the B-29 represented a threat they could not counter with existing equipment. The only hope was to deny the Americans forward bases. Iwo Jima, 800 miles from Tokyo, became the priority. If the island fell, the B-29s would have fighter escort all the way to the capital. The defense of Iwo Jima was therefore ordered to be absolute. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi received instructions to hold the island at all costs and to make the Americans pay 10-1. They did not know that the first B-29s were already operating from the Marianas, with a combat ceiling that would soon render even Iwo Jima's early warning radar irrelevant. The sanctuary was gone. The war had moved into the stratosphere, and Japan had nothing that could follow. On the night of March 9, 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay made a decision that stunned even his own staff. He ordered the Vixtientu Bomber Command to abandon high-altitude precision bombing and attack Tokyo at 5,000 to 7,000 feet with incendiaries. 334 B-29s took off from the Marianas carrying 6 pounds of napalm-based M69 bombs per square foot of target area. The altitude change was not because the bombers needed to be lower to hit targets. It was because LeMay had calculated that flying low would save fuel, allow heavier loads, and make the defensive gun system largely unnecessary. For the Japanese, the implications were catastrophic. At 02:37 on March 10th, the first Pathfinders dropped their marker bombs over the Shitamachi district. By 03:00, the main force was overhead. Japanese night fighters, already limited in effective operations above 30,000 feet, now found themselves facing bombers flying below their optimal combat altitude. The few Ki-45 Nick twin-engine fighters that managed to scramble were met by B-29 tail gunners firing from powered turrets at point-blank range. Anti-aircraft batteries, calibrated for high-altitude targets, could not depress their barrels fast enough. The result was the most destructive single air raid in history. 16 square miles of Tokyo burned, over 100,000 civilians perished, and 1 million were made homeless in a single night. The Japanese High Command received the first reports at dawn. Lieutenant General Masakazu Kawabe, commanding the General Defense Command, telephoned the Army Air Force headquarters in Tokyo and asked a question that revealed the depth of the crisis. Where were our fighters? The answer from Colonel Tadao Kato of the 10th Air Division was brutal in its simplicity. They could not reach the enemy in time, and when they did, the bombers were too low for effective interception. Within 48 hours, the same pattern repeated. On March 12th, Nagoya burned. On March 14th, Osaka. On March 17th, Kobe. 4 of Japan's 6 largest industrial cities were devastated in 1 week, all by bombers flying at altitudes Japanese fighters could theoretically reach, but never in sufficient numbers or with the coordination required. The B-29s were now stripping defensive armament entirely on some missions, replacing guns with extra fuel and bombs. The average bomb load rose from 4 tons per aircraft in the high-altitude phase to over 7 tons in the fire raids. The Japanese response was frantic but futile. In February 1945, the Army Air Force had formed the 19th Air Brigade specifically for high-altitude defense, equipped with modified Ki-84 Franks and the new Ki-100, a Ki-61 airframe with a radial engine. Test pilot Major Yozo Takada managed to reach 36,000 feet in a stripped Ki-100 on March 25th, but only for 3 minutes before the engine overheated. Production of the Ki-100 began in March, but only 58 were completed by May. The twin-engine Ki-45 Toryuu night fighter was fitted with upward-firing 20mm cannons in a Schrager music configuration, but the few that encountered B-29s found the bomber's speed and defensive fire overwhelming. The most desperate measure came in April, when the Army ordered ramming attacks. On April 7th, during a raid on the Nakajima factory at Ota, Lieutenant Yoshio Yoshida of the 47th Sentai deliberately rammed a B-29, becoming the first confirmed success of this tactic. Yoshida survived by parachute, but the cost was prohibitive. 1 experienced pilot and 1 aircraft for 1 B-29 damaged. By May, the policy was official. Any pilot who rammed a B-29 would be awarded a posthumous 2-rank promotion. The results were negligible. Only 9 B-29s were confirmed destroyed by ramming throughout the entire campaign. By April, the Japanese had accepted that conventional interception was impossible. The only remaining hope was to deny the Americans their forward bases. Iwo Jima fell on March 26th after 36 days of fighting that cost the U.S. Marines over 26,000 casualties. The island's airfields were operational by mid-March, and P-51 Mustangs began escorting B-29s on April 7th. The sanctuary of altitude was now gone at every level. Japanese radar on the home islands tracked formations escorted by fighters that could operate at 40,000 feet if needed. The psychological collapse was complete. On April 13th, during a raid on Tokyo, the Imperial Palace was struck for the first time when a stray incendiary bomb hit the royal compound. Emperor Hirohito reportedly stood on the palace roof watching the fires and asked General Kawabe, "Why can we not stop them?" Kawabe had no answer. The B-29 had not just brought the war to Japan's cities, it had removed the last illusion that the home islands were beyond reach. By the first week of May 1945, the Japanese High Command no longer spoke of stopping the B-29s. They spoke only of surviving them. On May 14th, 340 B-29s struck Nagoya again, this time in daylight from 20,000 feet. On May 23rd and 25th, Tokyo burned for the 3rd and 4th times in 10 weeks. By June 1st, 67 Japanese cities had been attacked, 40% of their total built-up area destroyed, and the industrial heart of the country reduced to smoking ruins. The B-29 had become the embodiment of a war Japan could no longer fight. The final confirmation came on July 26th, when the Potsdam Declaration was issued, demanding unconditional surrender. That same night, 479 superfortresses struck 6 secondary cities with incendiaries, while another 83 mined the Inland Sea and Shimonoseki Strait. Japanese radar tracked the formations, but no fighters rose to meet them. Fuel reserves for the entire Army Air Force stood at less than 2 weeks' supply at combat rates. The last operational high-altitude interceptors, the Ki-84s of the 101st and 102nd Sentai, had been transferred south to face the expected invasion of Kyushu and were no longer available for home defense. On August 6th, Colonel Paul Tibbets dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima from 31,600 feet. 3 days later, Major Charles Sweeney flew Bockscar to Kokura and, diverted by weather, released the second device over Nagasaki from 29,000 feet. Both missions were flown in broad daylight, with only weather scouts and observation aircraft as escort. No Japanese fighter challenged them. The altitude sanctuary that had protected the home islands since 1941 was now the highway along which the war ended. The Japanese realization was not a single moment, but a slow, grinding acceptance that began on November 24, 1944, and reached its conclusion 9 months later. It began with the first high-altitude raid from the Marianas, accelerated when the wings based there came online in January, became undeniable with the fire raids in March, and was sealed when Iwo Jima fell and P-51 escorts appeared overhead in April. By the time the atomic bombs fell, the Japanese military leadership had already concluded that conventional defense of the home islands was impossible. Post-war interrogations of surviving officers reveal the depth of the shock. General Kawabe told U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey investigators in November 1945, "When the B-29s began regular operations from the Marianas, we knew the war was lost. We had no aircraft that could reach them effectively, and our anti-aircraft fire was useless." Lieutenant General Cizo Arisue, Chief of Army Intelligence, stated bluntly, "The appearance of the B-29 was the decisive factor in our decision to seek peace." The numbers tell the story with merciless clarity. Between November 1944 and August 1945, the 29th Bomber Command flew 3 15 missions with 29, 579 individual sorties, dropping 169, 624 tons of bombs and 11, 950 tons of mines. Total B-29 combat losses to all causes, 414 aircraft, of which only 147 were to enemy action, and just 33 to fighters. Japan lost over 400,000 civilians and the industrial capacity to continue the war. The B-29 did not win the Pacific War alone, but it removed the last Japanese hope that geography and altitude could protect the home islands. It proved that in modern warfare, technological reach and industrial depth can place an enemy's heartland under direct threat long before ground forces arrive. The sanctuary of altitude that Japan had trusted for 4 years lasted exactly 9 months against an aircraft specifically designed to end it. When Japan realized the B-29s could fly above everything they had, they did not just lose the air war. They lost the illusion that the war could still be fought on their terms. If these minute-by-minute fact-based accounts of the moments everything changed are what you come here for, hit subscribe and ring the bell. A new documentary every single week. See you in the next one.